Welcome back, students. Tonight we will begin a short study of genetics and heredity. We will start with section 1, which is called Mendel and his keys. In subsequent lectures, we'll talk about how Mendel's experiments help us understand inheritance today. Section 3 on DNA we have already completed, and it's going to be important that you remember what you learned in that section in order to understand what we're going to be going back now and talking about in section 1 and 2. Okay, so let's begin by recognizing something that we already intuitively know, which is that an organism is a collection of physical features and functions. And these features and functions, in science, we call them traits. Now, the unique combination of traits that an organism has are not just random. In fact, all of an organism's traits come from somewhere. They are inherited from the organism's parents. That word inherited, I hope that you're familiar with it. It means passed down from a previous generation. So we have this vocabulary word, heredity, which means something that is inherited. Here, what I would like for you to have for the definition is that heredity is the passing of traits from one parent to its offspring. From a set of parents to offspring. In science, there's a whole field of study in which we investigate heredity, or how traits are passed down from generation to generation. So we call the studying of the passing of traits, or the study of heredity, the field of genetics. And so, chapter 5 could also be called genetics. Okay, so let's go back and remember from a little bit earlier in the year what exactly determines an organism's traits. I hope that this question, the answer to this question springs to your mind because we've had it before. We've said that an organism's traits are determined by the proteins that it makes. And so then we have to ask ourselves, what determines the proteins that we make? You should remember that the proteins that we make are determined by our genes, specifically the nitrogen base sequences in our genes. Remember all those A, T, C's, and G's that we learned about earlier in the year? Well, we had said that the order of those nitrogen bases in our genes matters because it determines what protein is made. The protein that is made determines the traits that we exhibit. Okay, so let's review some more concepts that we learned earlier in the year so that we can set a good foundation for understanding genetics. First, recall that a diploid organism is one that has 2 copies of each chromosome. Remember that one of those copies came from dad, carried in the haploid sperm, and that the other copy came from mom, carried in a haploid egg. When those two haploid gametes joined, it formed a diploid organism. Now, although each chromosome contains the same genes as its copy, in other words, the copy that you got from mom contains the same sequence of genes as the copy that you got from dad. So, there's the same sequence of genes, but I'm going to show you that the form of the genes may not be the same on both copies. So write that down, and I know it's a little bit confusing, so I'm going to actually show you on a blank sheet what I mean by this. So please go ahead and get a blank sheet of paper now. You can pause the video, go get a blank sheet of paper so that you can copy this down and attach it to your notes. Switch to blank. Okay. So here's what I would like for you to do. I want you to draw Oh, wow. This drawing thing's going to be a little challenging on this for me. Just draw a chromosome like this. And then I want you to draw another chromosome. Wow. Like this. Okay, now this is a pair of chromosomes. Remember that you have 23 pairs of these. We're just going to call this pair 1. Okay, so this is pair 1 out of your 23 pairs. So remember that one of these would come from Dad. Okay, so maybe this copy of chromosome, oops, sorry, this should have been pair 1. So maybe this copy of chromosome 1 came from Dad, and then this one came from Mom. And so you've got both. Now, if we look at chromosome 1 from Dad, let's just say we see this sequence. Maybe there's a gene here. Okay, and maybe that gene is for eye color. And then if we go further down the chromosome, let's say we get to another gene. And remember, these genes would have nitrogen base sequences in them, A, T, C's, and G's. Let's say that this one is for height. And then we keep on going further down the chromosome. And there's another gene, and I'm obviously oversimplifying this. You would have thousands of genes on one chromosome, but I'm oversimplifying it. Let's say that this gene is for blood type. Okay, so that chromosome from Dad is going to have the same sequence. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. It's going to have the same set of genes in the same order on Mom's chromosome as well. So if Dad had an eye gene at this position on the chromosome, Mom would also have an eye color gene at that position on the chromosome. If Dad has a height gene at this position, then Mom will also have a height gene at the same position on her chromosome 1. Okay. So in this sense, this is why when we say the genes that are on Mom's chromosomes and Dad's chromosomes, or in other words, the genes that are on chromosome 1 are the same, this is what we mean by it, the same order of genes. So if Dad had a blood type gene there, Mom at the same spot on her chromosome 1 would have given you a blood type gene. Now, the thing is that even though the types of genes are found on chromosome 1 that you got from Dad and chromosome 1 that you got from Mom, they're found in the same order, the actual base sequence inside the gene could be different. So, for example, Dad's eye color gene may have a sequence for blue eyes. At the same time, the eye color gene that Mom has may have a different nitrogen base sequence. So even though it's an eye color gene, if the base sequence is different, then her eye color gene may actually write instructions for giving you brown eyes. So you are carrying two different eye color genes, one from dad that says blue eyes and one from mom that says brown eyes. In the same way, maybe dad is carrying a blood type gene for type A blood, while mom is carrying one for type O blood. So you have two forms of the gene. You have one from dad that says type A and one from mom that says type O. Now sometimes they could have the exact same sequence. So perhaps dad is carrying a gene for height that says tall. Mom can carry the same sequence in her height gene that could also say tall. So they do not have to be different from each other. Sometimes they're exactly the same sequence. Okay, so we're going to go back to the PowerPoint. I hope that you have this concept now that even though you have the same genes, the actual content of the instructions of the nitrogen bases in the gene may be different, resulting in a different protein being made and you having a different trait. So let's go back to this. Two different forms of a trait that make up a gene pair are called alleles. So what we were just looking at, you had, for the eye color gene, two different alleles. You had a brown allele and a blue allele. For the blood type gene, I give you two different alleles, two different forms of that gene. I said it could be type A or type O. So even though they're the same gene, they're both a gene for blood type, there's two different forms. And so we would call those forms alleles. Now, to review for what that means for us, because each somatic cell in the body, remember somatic cells are your body cells. Remember that they're diploid, so because they're diploid, they have two copies of each chromosome. That means that each somatic cell will have two alleles for each trait. Like I was just showing you. Each somatic cell will have two copies of the eye color gene, not just one. You'll have two copies of the blood protein gene, not just one. In other words, you have two alleles for each trait. That also means that when a cell undergoes meiosis, that is, making haploid cells, each chromosome copy will go into a separate sex cell. Because of this, each sex cell will only have one allele for each trait. Okay, that is it for tonight. We are going to talk a lot more about this in class because the introduction to genetics can be somewhat confusing. So, I hope you've got a basic understanding of what we just talked about. I hope you got some of these definitions down, and we're going to work more with this new vocabulary in class. All right, take your Quizmodo, and I'll see you tomorrow.